All right, we are on the Bridge podcast here, and I'm excited to bring back Andres Gomez Emilsson from the Qualia Research Institute. This is the first round two episode of the Bridge podcast, and it's episode 43. So, prime number for this prime guy. Welcome back, Andres. It's good to have you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Wow, like 43. That's a bunch since we chatted.
Yeah, um, I was slow for a while, and then I sped up, and found a good pace. Um,
Excellent.
so
Excellent.
as you remember last time, we talked about your eight models of qualia, part of the harmonic society thing, and since then I've been watching these like monologue videos you've been doing on YouTube, and reading your articles, reading Mike Johnson's articles, and it's such cool stuff, and so I have like kind of like a just a huge list of random stuff that we can go through to talk about, but and generally, I open asking about people's coffee preferences, but I got that last time. Unless you have any sort of update to your coffee preferences, um, have they changed at all?
Do maybe, yeah, actually. I think well, I now brew coffee every day rather than only drink instant coffee. I
Okay.
guess I mean instant coffee is like extremely pragmatic and like very efficient and not too terrible, but there is a qualitative improvement, and I do prefer what I'm doing now, and I'm just like sampling through like a bunch of possibilities, and I wouldn't say like I have developed any taste for any particular coffee. I'm
Hmm,
a relative beginner when it comes to like actually knowing what you're drinking.
for sure. However, it seems like in the meantime you've become quite the perfumer. I don't know if that's the term. So I mean, like your sort of way of starting your talks is usually like the quality of the day, and they're always really interesting. But I was thinking at first like we could do like a tea tasting or a coffee tasting, but some other time. So I'm curious though, when did this whole perfumery thing start for you?
Sure. So, I've been fascinated by smell for a long time. I mean, I would say like I did not pay attention to smell in general when I was a kid, except for a trip to France where we went to kind of like some lavender distilleries. And I was just like fascinated by lavender. I had never smelled lavender. And I thought like, oh my gosh, like this smell is gonna change the world. Like it really feels, right? Like the difference between a world with lavender and without it seems like really significant, right? Like you're missing out on something very important. Um, but yeah, okay, like I kind of like didn't pay too much attention to it for a while. Then when I was a teenager, I used to go to perfume stores and just like sample everything out of curiosity. But I did not do it like in a systematic way. I did not like learn about it. I don't know. I read the perfume, but I didn't investigate very much or like practice or anything. But recently, I would say like 3 years ago or so, yeah, I decided to kind of like start collecting essential oils, kind of like getting a big picture of like actually what's out there in the state space of possible scents. And I guess
Mhm.
like it really kind of like came about as like the rationale. I mean, like the rationale really was okay. Like there's like a lot of like very relatively like mundane qualia out there that
Mhm.
like I think we can like describe in like new and meaningful, non-trivial ways. Um, that is like maybe literally under people's nose, so to speak.
Mhm.
Um, but and like if we can demonstrate that like okay like we can say like really new and interesting things about these like things that like everybody like is acquainted with, hopefully like that will increase a little bit people's trust in like the fact that like I think that we say like also meaningful things about, let's say, like exotic states of consciousness like meditation and high end kind of like psychedelic journeys and,
Mhm.
and so on. So like um I don't know. I guess it kind of makes sense, right? Like if somebody's really good at describing a scent, hopefully you will take their descriptions of DMT more seriously. I don't know. That's maybe one of the rationale. Um, but yeah, so like I started collecting essential oils, um, but I didn't really kind of like dive more deeply into kind of like actually mapping out the state space of scents until the lockdown. so essentially in the lockdown, what happened was like, okay, like there's all of these reports of COVID taking people's like sense of smell.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, it actually seemed like very likely that it would be like permanent for a lot of people, and it is permanent for a percentage of people. I actually have like a um, how did like yeah the husband of a cousin of mine actually has permanently lost the sense of smell. It does happen, and it was like because of COVID. But it seems to be somewhat rare, and most people recover their sense of smell, at least like 90% of it. But essentially, what happened was like, okay, like I'm like locked down. I have a lot more time than I used to, um, and like I might lose my sense of smell. So basically, that kind of like was a
Mm-hmm.
motivating force for okay, like maybe now is the time to actually like take advantage of the fact that I still have a pretty good, functioning sense of smell. It's also worth pointing out that like sense of smell does deteriorate quite a bit over one's lifetime. Particularly the strength, not so much the strength and sensitivity, not so much like the quality of it. Like
Interesting.
I haven't seen like any research on like I don't know, like sour smells become like less intense relative to like like fragrant smells or something like that. Like I have not seen anything like that, but it might be the case. But it does seem to be that like from one's 30s, essentially the sensitivity to smell starts to decrease. And at first it's like pretty slow. Like the difference between like 30s and 40s is like relatively minimal. Between 40s and 50s, you start to see an important difference, and then from 50s onwards, like it starts to decline pretty rapidly, unfortunately. So yeah, basically I'm like at my prime or at my peak of like sensitivity.
Mm-hmm.
So like I also thought like okay, like let's take advantage of it now. So yeah, I mean I started actually buying like pure molecules, and then as kind of like a challenge to myself, I at the beginning of the journey, essentially, I set myself the challenge of replicating like common sense from scratch without like looking up the formulas. So, like for example, it's like okay, like I have like these 120 different molecules that I just bought. Can I make the scent of lemon with it? Um, and that's like a really fascinating exercise. And like, I mean, definitely recorded like every experiment that I've done, and at the beginning, like I did not know what I was doing in the least. Like mixing all these weird chemicals in very weird proportions,
Mm-hmm.
like very strange smells. But over time, I've become essentially, yeah, like quite acquainted with like what is possible in the space of sense, and actually what are the building blocks. I don't know. I could talk about it for hours, I think, but but I don't know how interested you are or like what aspect of it interests you. So yeah.
Well, I'm curious, just real quick, is seeing some of the talk on Twitter about the loss of scent. Some people have mentioned that, you can, restore it with LSD. I'm curious what your credence is on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's quite a bit of anecdotal data in the positive direction. I know of at least one person for whom it did not work,
Okay.
and it's quite likely that there's a bias, for like actually reporting or like amplifying the messages of the people for whom it did work. My suspicion is that like if rigorous research were to be done on it, like something like maybe like 10% of the people would actually recover it with that method.
Mm-hmm.
Like I really doubt it's like a magic bullet. Because yeah, I think like if we would know about it, it would be like yeah. I mean like people have lost their sense of smell also with like just the flu, right? Like and
Yeah.
my sense is like yeah, if like LSD was like a really reliable way of recovering it, it would be like a well-known thing. If it is something like okay, 10% of people get that, then it's like okay, like rare enough that like it makes sense only now that would be amplified. Um, yeah, Mike actually was working on a little piece about like why and try to explain it through like neural annealing and a few other
Mm-hmm.
like concepts that like we haven't really talked about very much. Um, but it is a very interesting kind of hmm, like essentially like there might be a very interesting mechanism of action for like how that happens. But also it could be like a very mundane thing. Like it could be like something biochemical. But
Hmm.
if it is like a very interesting like neural annealing effect, it would be a fascinating like topic of research because
Yeah, definitely.
it would essentially be metaphorically, it would be about like in a sense how to reinflate a collapsed set of harmonics, or like yeah, basically how to reinflate is that full dimensionality to like a network that has collapsed its dimensionality. That's more or less how we were thinking about it. But yeah, we, as I said, like we haven't really written very much about that theory.
Interesting. Okay. Um, yeah, I checked out some of the Luca Turin stuff. It seems like he took down some of those lectures from YouTube. Or I only saw like lesson one or whatever. But
Yeah,
this idea of was it the vibrational theory of olfaction? Is that his term?
yeah,
I thought that's an interesting sort of way that you could look at it that's similar to music, and like hearing you talk about losing your sense of smell gradually makes me think of how similar that is to losing your sense of hearing. And maybe you can still distinguish 50 hertz versus, or not 50, but like 100 hertz versus 150 hertz, but with lower volume or something like that. But maybe this question of olfaction is a good way to get into sort of symmetry theory of valence as well as music generally speaking, because that's most of what I want to talk about, I guess. When I see you talking about some of these aromas and stuff, you've said like higher entropy, lower entropy. I'm familiar with the concept of entropy and like Shannon to some extent, but what exactly do you mean when you say like this is a higher entropy aroma?
yeah, for sure. So what's going on there is uh, so like key piece of background is that there is essentially different kinds of alloys. So like most alloys are essentially like very high proportion of like one metal, and then like a sprinkling of like a few other metals. So steel is like some like at least 99% iron, and then like a little bit of carbon. Um, and yeah, I mean, like most alloys have been like that historically, and mostly because there really hasn't been like any good theory for like how to mix a lot of metals together. Um, but like more or less recently, like researchers have actually started kind of like investigating what happens when you mix like way more, metals together.
Mm.
With experiments like, for example, combining like 20 different metals simultaneously.
Mm.
And yeah, if you combine 20 metals, like they don't form a uniform phase. Essentially, what happens is that you get kind of these um, sprawling clustering of different metallic phases interlocking with one another. But then if you like kind of like zoom in, you can like discern like crystals, and the crystals will actually be made of like the same phase, meaning like the same geometric structure. Um, and those crystals will generally be like made of like a lot of different metals. So like what you can do is then kind of like look at what is the proportion of the metals in those crystals, and then just kind of like make a big batch with
Mm.
only those metals in those proportions, and then you will form like actually a metallic phase that like it's all of those metals are like actually part of the same geometric structure, and those are called essentially high entropy alloys, because one way of talking about entropy is essentially what is the information content in it. How
Okay.
how much um, like how much information do you need to describe it, and with what like margin of error? Right, like
Okay.
to a first approximation, like steel is just iron, right? So in that sense, like saying like, oh, like this is iron approximates it really well. But if you have something that is like 20% of like five different metals, um, saying any one of those metals is not like actually giving you that much information about like the full alloy. So in that sense, it has a high kind of a description length, right? So in that sense, it's a high entropy alloy. Um, and similarly, sorry, do you have a?
Oh no, no, go
Okay, then
ahead.
yeah, similarly with smells, essentially what I realized is that most perfumes um, tend to have like a profile where you can essentially approximate what the perfume smells like with a relatively simple description. I mean, like there's like a lot of perfumes that you can say, let's say, yeah, this is like cedarwood and rosemary. and like, okay, like those two things, or like, will cover
Hmm.
80% of like whatever that smell is. Similar to like saying like, yeah, this is made of iron, but no, it's actually iron and carbon. Like you just need to kind of like, um, you need to expand the description if you want like to get really accurate, but like you have already like a decent description. So when you have what I describe as a high entropy alloy, and I don't know if I have a maybe this one. I actually just happen to have this laying around. This might be a high entropy alloy, and essentially what happens with that is that there's no simple description you can give that will actually kind of cover the bulk of what it is about. So like for this one, I wouldn't be able to say like, oh, this is like rose. This is because it's not a rose perfume. Like if I say this is a rose perfume, you will get like maybe like 20% of an idea of what this
Okay.
smells like. Um, and the thing though is that like I don't mean high entropy actually in perfumes in terms of like the molecular composition, because you could have like something that is like molecularly very complex but sensorially very simple. Like
Okay.
you could have like this, something made of 100 molecules, but it's like, yeah, this smells exactly like lavender, and that would be a low entropy. And you could actually have like something made of like very few molecules and still smell really complex and like rich and difficult to describe. Like there is this one molecule called uh, agrumate aldehyde light, which is a very bizarre molecule because it's just one molecule, but it smells like sweet and sour and soapy and ethereal, and it's just like this very complex thing. And a perfume made of that and a couple more molecules might already be a high entropy perfume. Yeah. Anyway, I think a lot of it in terms of kind of um, like cellular automata. Like if you look at like the space of possible rules in
Hmm.
cellular automata, there's like a huge region where like nothing interesting happens, and then maybe there's like a sliver in
Hmm.
parameter space where like, oh, you actually have like life or you have like interesting structures
Right.
emerge. And so like actually small differences in that sliver like matter a lot, right? It's like, okay, you change the parameter slightly and then different creatures, different animals are possible in that cellular automata. I think it's the same with the smell. Essentially, there's like huge regions of how you can combine molecules that will produce like uninteresting like scents, or like scents that are just kind of variations on the same theme. And then you have like some like small range of like proportions for molecules where like tiny changes will kind of like generate like very different chaotic effects in your factory bulb. Um, and that's like where it gets really interesting, and that's usually where like high entropy alloys leave. And yeah, just to give an example, like uh, I also have, yeah, this one is like a fairly straightforward high entropy alloy because you can say it smells like bergamot, but again, like that's only like 20-30% of what it's about. So yeah, hopefully that clarifies it.
I think so. This makes me think of like you were talking about like the recipe versus the review, I think. So is it saying essentially like with a simpler recipe, the review is more complex, or vice
Yeah,
versa?
yeah, that would be that's a very related framework for sure. Um, yeah, absolutely. So like, and actually that's really interesting. So there's this phenomenon I call scent factorization.
Okay.
Not very formal. I'm sure there's a better way of talking about it, but I mean essentially, um, like if you smell a particular essential oil, it may smell like, okay, like this smells like both soapy and like citrusy, let's say. And then you smell a different essential oil, and it's like, oh, this smells like soapy and flowery. And like, well, okay, this a different one smells like soapy and fruity or something. Okay, like if you combine all of those together, the soapy character may be the only thing that is in common. And all of a sudden, like when with the actual mixture, it will smell like soapy plus white noise, or like soapy plus like, okay, like this indescript, like very generic mixture of a lot of things that kind of like gets averaged out and it doesn't really capture your attention.
Okay.
So I call that like scent factorization. In a sense, you're putting a lot of things together that share the same facet, and the other things kind of average themselves out. Um, so that's why you can actually have like something that is made of a lot of molecules, but it smells very simple because in a sense, all of those molecules share some attribute and the non-shared component gets averaged out. So that's why like, yeah, I mean, the recipe for a very simple smell could actually be very complicated and the other way around.
Interesting. Okay. So this makes me think of like chords and when you combine different frequencies and they have different sort of ways that they resonate together. And I know that like like a perfect fifth in music is like a 2 to 3 ratio, etc. Is there like are you relating these molecules harmonically in any way, or like is that having to do with them having that sort of resonance with one another?
Yeah, that's a definitely like a very tricky question. I mean, I think like I would say that I do believe that I have a sane theory of smells. um, and it's like kind of non-trivial to explain it, but like I'll do my best like in a short amount of time. So essentially, like yes, I do believe the the vibrational theory of olfaction like makes sense, and I suspect it's actually correct. Um, and the reason I think so is that like after experimenting a lot with molecules, I essentially do agree with Luca Turin that functional groups actually smell like something. That if you have a molecule that's an aldehyde, it doesn't matter what it like how it is shaped, as long as it has an aldehyde and it has like any perceptible smell, it will smell like an aldehyde vibe.
Okay.
Um, and the same with like alcohols and esters and molecules with sulfur. And essentially, the particular bonds of molecules that have like these functional groups will have a particular resonant frequency. And essentially, if you look at how they vibrate, um, and there's like, yeah, all of these like fascinating software where you can put in the, the shape of a molecule and it will show you like what its vibrational modes are. Well, it turns out that, yeah, some of the vibrational modes have to do with essentially what are the bonds present, and a functional group will determine that. So if you look at the spectrum of a molecule, part of it has to do with what are the functional groups in it. Um, Now, why would you be able to smell that? Well, the answer that Luca Turin came up with is that essentially particular vibrational modes function as um, basically like energy jumps or like an energy, yeah, like energy differences where like an electron can essentially um, dispose of potential energy if it has the appropriate resonant frequency.
Hmm.
And so in essence, like what actually receptors are doing, receptors of scent are doing, there's like two things. One, the molecule has to be appropriately shaped to actually enter into the receptor, but then it actually also needs to have the appropriate vibrational mode so that an electron can essentially use that as kind of like an
Hmm.
energy jump in order to discharge energy.
Gotcha.
So essentially, it's kind of like, I mean, imagine kind of like a credit card or something like that, right? Like you need two things. A, it has to be the right shape. Like it has to actually fit in kind of like one of these like reading slots. Um, and B, it has to have the right information. So it's something like that, like a molecule to smell a particular way, it has to have the right shape to feed into the receptor. And then it also needs to have the right vibrational mode so the receptor recognizes it.
Gotcha.
And how potent it is might have to do with the shape, but then the quality has to do with the resonant vibrational modes. That is not to say, though, that the actual smell will have anything to do with the vibrational mode. And like
Gotcha.
the vibrational mode, all it's relevant here is to activate the receptor. But then there's still like actually physiologically, there's like 3 layers of neurons of neural processing between activating a receptor and that having any kind of like influence on the activity in the olfactory bulb. So the full story is that I actually very, very strongly believe that the phenomenology of scent has to do with vibrational modes,
Hmm.
but I think it has to do with vibrational modes of the olfactory bulb and how those relate to the central nervous system,
Interesting.
which is different than saying like that we can actually perceive the vibrations of the molecules. So that's
Right.
because there's actually like several layers of interaction between those two things.
Interesting. Okay. Um, Damn, that's complicated and deep stuff. I'm curious to just go back to the conversation that we had last time about the 8 modes of artistic qualia. I'm curious if you've added any models to that list.
Mm, Not explicit. I mean, I would say that that at least works really well as a overarching kind of a framework for making sense of art. Um, what we have definitely kind of developed a lot further is um, kind of like thinking of different aesthetics and like kind of like how you can use aesthetics for coordination, how you can use aesthetics for actually like like presenting different like ways to reduce suffering or ways of being happy. Like what does it mean to be happy? Like different aesthetics have like will have like different opinions about that. Um, but as such, I think like a formal theory of art, I think like it's what we had like is pretty decent. I don't think we need to update that, but kind of like with that as a framework, as kind of a foundation, exploring different aesthetics is something that we have been doing quite a bit.
Gotcha. Cool. Um, well, I mentioned this is episode number 43, and so I wanted to see if you could tell me a little bit about prime number qualia, and I spoke actually with Bill Cetheris after seeing your thing about him and numerology.
Oh,
And
you talked to him.
mhm.
Oh, I should watch that. Yeah.
Yeah, I've been on a long kick of like conversations with microtonal people, and I know
Oh
he's
my
in that
goodness.
sort of Zen tonality world. But yeah, I mean, I mentioned to you on Twitter Harry Parch and his music, which is tuned on a 43 tone system, which is
Mm.
kind of weird. But then I also spoke to David Rothenberg, who does this interspecies collaboration with like whales and cicadas. He has albums collaborating with cicadas, and so when I talked to him, we were talking about how they have their 17-year cycle, and kind of like the different theories of why that might be. And some people were saying like maybe the prime number makes it like better for them in avoiding prey. And I'm curious if you have any take on that.
Yeah, sure. That's a lot. Well, first of all, congratulations on having interviewed William Setheris. I definitely would love to talk to him at some point. I'm very curious about what he thinks of like, yeah, for example, symmetry theory of valence
Hmm.
would be a good conversation to have with him. But no, that's awesome. What is the name of the musician you sent me again?
Oh, his name's David Rothenberg.
Yeah, yeah, I listened to quite a few of his songs. And I thought it was fascinating. Like, essentially, he seems to like what I would describe as like surfing
Oh, sorry,
the.
you're talking about Harry Parch, I think. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, yes, that's right. Harry Pratchett. Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead. That's fine.
He likes to. Sorry. And also, by the way, I'm recording separately, so I can send you the audio file
Cool.
afterwards. So
Thank
without
you.
interruptions. So, um, Harry Parchett, yeah. So I think like he likes to surf the edge of musicality is the way I would describe it. That is kind of like starts to generate some quasi rhythmic patterns that like gives you the suggestion like, oh wow, like there's like some musicality here, and then he kind of like deflates that pattern, like it doesn't happen, and then like he's kind of like surfing that edge like constantly, and I think it's really interesting. And in a sense, like yes, I do think there is this threshold for what musicality is. So essentially, you do require kind of a threshold of like melodic coherence and repetition or rhythmicity in order to kickstart some kind of like rhythmic interlocking between brain harmonics
Hmm.
that like feels good. And it's like, okay, yeah, this is kind of like a good foundation for like a mood, for example. And yeah, some musicians seem to kind of like play with like, I got it or you don't, like it's kind of there. Um, so yeah, that's really interesting. Now, when it comes to like prime numbers, yeah. So Daniel Tammet is a savant with autism, but like what's really fascinating about him is that also he's like has kind of like an average verbal ability, which is like rare for people with kind of like that cognitive style. Like there's even like a lot of like nonverbal like autists that have like a very heavy synesthesia and like interesting like yeah abilities to process numbers and things like that, but they can't speak, so like we can't actually like know what the experience is like. Whereas yeah, Daniel Tammet is unusual for that reason, that like at least he has like average, like verbal skills. And you can ask him like, what is it like to like actually, like solve one of these problems. So the kind of problems that he likes to do are, for example, like memorizing like very large strings of numbers, and he does it very quickly and very efficiently. Another thing that he likes to do is like, very simple arithmetic computations, like, okay, like what is the product of these two numbers, or what is the um, division between these two numbers. And basically he says that in all of these cases he actually experiences this as a synesthetic kind of a computation, that like when he memorizes a number, he's actually constructing a multi-sensory object that is being fine-tuned to fit all the properties of the number. So like, for example, when he memorized pi, he actually has kind of this weird synesthetic structure that represents pi, and is like very detailed, and it has kind of like, curves and twists of different colors. And the more digits he memorizes, the more detailed and structured it becomes. So that is like one example of, in one way, is kind of like Qualia computing being used for a new and exotic application. It's like, okay, let's let a brain that is actually generating these like complex multisensory representations that then are actually finely tuned such that you can combine them and they actually interact in a lawful and computationally useful way. So like whatever is going on in his brain is like really interesting from the point of view of Qualia research.
Yeah, definitely.
And he also describes that he has the ability to intuitively determine whether a number is prime. And essentially, you can give him a fairly large number, like let's say like a 6-digit number or something like that, 7-digit number. And he kind of feels it around. And he says that, yeah, after a while, like it either kind of like factorizes into like different subcomponents that are themselves like made of synesthetic structures, or he realizes that it's a prime number. And like supposedly when he actually feels that it's a prime number, it's kind of like a big explosion of senses, because his brain is like realizing that like, okay, this is like a unique, like new thing that cannot be decomposed into like building blocks. It actually kind of like stands as a whole. And I think that's fascinating. I think like that's something very worth thinking more about, like how, like what's one of the fascinating things about like actually having bound experiences, like actually having like unified moments of experience, is that there is like an irreducible quality to it, that like the actual unity of it, the actual the fact that all the information is coming together at once, cannot be fundamentally reduced to kind of like, okay, just these atoms interacting with one another. You actually have kind of this like irreducible structure. And these synesthetic prime numbers would be kind of like an extreme example of this. Is like essentially these gems in the state space of consciousness that are completely hidden, and you have to actually search them in a very, very systematic way with a finely tuned process. And yeah, I mean, what I imagine is that, yeah, like the particular experience that Daniel Tammet might have for like a prime number of 7 digits is an experience that has never existed in the universe, because it, that particular irreducible Qualia representation, it's just like so difficult to find. It's something essentially it's kind of hidden in the state spaces. So yeah, anyway, so I think that's maybe something interesting to say about prime numbers.
Totally. It's funny, like I have on the list basically talking about some animal consciousness stuff, but I mean, do you feel like the idea of like a 17-year cycle for cicadas, like what do you think about that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I
Is
think
there anything special?
I'm sure there's something, and I suspect it is like avoiding interlocking with like some other like natural rhythm. Yeah, essentially, yeah, it makes sense. I mean, like you don't want to enter in a relationship with like a predator that like it will have like the same cycle as yours. So that like, okay, when there's like a population explosion of cicadas, it will also be a population explosion of like hawks or something. I don't know what eats them, but like, yeah, whatever like is the main predator. Um, so it would make sense that they would actually like figure out a way to create something that is very difficult to interlock with. That it would make sense. It would be evolutionarily adaptive. And my sense is like we probably will see things of that nature like all over the place. Like for example, what is camouflage? Like camouflage in, for example, like insects. My sense is that a lot of it it's actually about like hiding symmetries, because
Mm.
if you are like an insect, you have like a lot of symmetrical structures and properties. um, those kind of like repeating patterns are something that like a visual system can identify. It's like, oh, like, okay, that must be an insect because it has like 6 legs and those 6 legs look the same. But with camouflage, it tries to break those symmetries. And in that way, it is kind of like trying to jam or prevent kind of like harmonic interlocking from some other sense modality from another species. And I'd imagine actually that will also in general be somewhat related to prime numbers, because um, it's kind of like the least repeating patterns that you can find.
Gotcha. Yeah, I mean, in music, it seems like as you go up the overtone series, like each new prime number is like a new tonal identity. Because if you keep on just doing octaves, or if you do composite numbers, then you're essentially just getting redundancies, right? So like, it's like that's how you would add tonal character, maybe. But um, anyway, so I mentioned yesterday on Twitter that I'm a metrosexual in that I am attracted to metronomes. Um, Got one right here. Uh, but this reminds me, of your post that you did about the dark rooms in, collaboration with Astral Codex 10, and like, metronomes as like a perfect source of symmetry, sort of.
Yeah.
But also, brings me to that. I think it's called "The Future of Neuroscience" that Mike Johnson wrote, and that article just like hit me, and I was like, that this guy gets it.
Yeah.
And so the
Yeah.
notion of E and Q, I'm sort of curious about this, and like I did a little brief presentation for guitar stuff about like how to practice with a metronome very slow, and I referenced Mike Johnson because it's like if you're able to stay in rhythm with a metronome that's going say 20 beats per minute, which is like that's a slow tempo,
Yeah.
then like you're actually able to entrain to something pretty adaptively. So I felt like maybe that's an interesting heuristic for that, but I'd be curious to hear more thoughts on ENQ and NAQ.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess like first of all, um, metronomes. Um, what I was talking about with Scott Alexander, I mean, essentially he was saying like, okay, like if you do believe like in this symmetry theory of valence, doesn't that entail that like if you just listen to a very simple tone or like a metronome, like that's gonna be the happiest or like the highest valence experience? And like he was puzzled by that and skeptical. Um, but I just explained like, well, yes, actually, like if you do actually enter into a state of absorption, like very very high level of concentration, listening to a pure tone is gonna sound really incredible and like fulfilling. I mean, like Shenzhen Young talks about like how um, most of what we consider to be pleasure in our everyday life is actually grasping,
Hmm.
and like most people have actually never experienced like unadulterated pleasure, like pleasure without grasping, without craving. Um, so like that's actually like fairly rare, and highly concentrated states of consciousness can actually experience something very simple in a very satisfying way, like that is like very pleasant but also fulfilling. And
Hmm.
that's a key difference. And essentially, I mean, like very very high concentration is needed for that, but it is doable and it happens. And essentially what you will see is that people who attain like very very high concentration states, they're actually fully satisfied with like even less. Like for example, just empty space. Like
Hmm.
empty space becomes extremely beautiful, and they can experience like literally like a sense of uh, unbounded, like kind of a spatial awareness field that is extremely satisfying. Um, but also, with a pure tone, with a simple shape, like if you do like a casino retreat, like looking at a candle flame, like
Hmm.
you don't need a complex stimuli to be like engrossed by it and actually like feeling satisfied by it. Um, so all of that is to say that it sounds ridiculous, but like extremely high valence states of consciousness can be extremely simple and can be things of the sort of, yeah, I'm just like completely in tune with this metronome. Now, a very important conceptual kind of clarification here is that you don't actually become the shape you're synchronizing with. You become actually something weirder. You become what we call the oscillatory complement. Essentially, if you're like extremely in tune with a metronome, it's not that you become that metronome, rather you become something that is perfectly capable of predicting that metronome. So
Interesting.
how to, like, I don't really have like a great like intuitive description of this, but like it's kind of like you're trying to become the thing that is surrounding it, that is oscillating in a complementary way, so that like whenever it actually sends a stimuli to you, you're like meeting it in perfect tune. So implicitly, yes, you're generating kind of that particular metronome, but actually the shape of your consciousness will be something that is not that metronome. It's actually whatever is capable of perfectly predicting it, which may or may not be like a super simple thing. Like usually it will be a very simple thing, but doesn't have to. So as a consequence, it is not the case that the valence of your experience will essentially be exactly corresponding to the information content or whatever you absorb into, because there can be some cases where the thing that you're synchronizing with is very simple, but for you to be the oscillatory complement of that thing, you yourself need to be a complex structure.
Interesting.
And yeah, and I think like this actually, like you can see with some, like for example, like stroboscopic stimulation, that like there's a region of frequencies where you actually experience like some level of complexity in the resulting hallucinations. So for example, like 12 hertz, 12 to 16 hertz, you actually experience kind of like interesting like patterns and structures, as opposed to, let's say, anything about like 40 hertz, where actually the stroboscopic stimulation kind of like becomes like very continuous. So what's going on there in a way is that within that window of frequencies, the oscillatory complement of the nervous system is actually a fairly complex thing. So even though the stimuli is very simple, you don't actually settle on something that is like actually very simple. I think also something like that is going on with kind of the difference between DMT and 5-MeO DMT. That like with DMT, essentially like it activates like some particular metronomes in your brain, and those metronomes like themselves can be fairly simple. Like DMT will have kind of like this like very strong like metronome, like 30 hertz kind of a stroboscopic stimulation, but the resulting hallucinations are extremely chaotic and complex. Whereas on 5-MeO DMT, you also have like this like flickering frequency that I think it's a higher frequency, and you do like have the ability to syntonize with it in a way that has like very little information. So anyway, I know this is like a roundabout way of saying, but ultimately what actually matters is the complexity of you, not the complexity of the stimuli.
Gotcha.
And in general, there's going to be a correlation with the complexity of the stimuli and the complexity of, what is the oscillatory complement of that stimuli, but it's not always the case. So it's kind of some complications.
I guess there's like this weird phenomenon, or like phenomenology of practicing with a metronome. Like when you're finally perfectly in rhythm, the metronome disappears, and I feel like that's maybe what you're getting at in like sort of reduced way. But
100%, yeah. So that's exactly right. So if there's kind of like an annoying sound or like an annoying stimuli, there's two things you can do. There's actually three, but like approximately the first approximation, there's like two things. So like you can like develop a model internally that is really good at predicting it. And if you actually become like perfect at predicting the stimuli, it fades from your consciousness. You can almost kind of like think about it as like from a predictive coding perspective,
Mm-hmm.
that like what you're conscious of is essentially what your brain is still having like difficulties predicting. Because the things that you actually predict perfectly, um, in a sense, you're kind of like canceling out. Um,
Interesting.
and It's not exactly true, because I think you're still conscious. It's just that the consciousness actually has like no information content, because it's not being disturbed by the stimuli. You're like kind of like meeting it and accounting for it every time. And in a sense, that makes you an untroubled mind. And an untroubled mind is a high valence mind. It, it doesn't feel like much, but it's actually like, yeah, just untroubled. So that's one way. But another way of actually not being bothered by a stimuli is to dissociate from it. And that is, in a sense, like all of your attention is focused on kind of like the innermost resonant modes. And yes, you can kind of like be disturbed a little bit, but not enough that it actually will disturb the main resonant modes that you're paying attention to. So this is kind of like a classic example would be like ketamine. Like ketamine, for example, I think like partly what it does is decouples the innermost layers of your central nervous system from the peripheral nervous system and the senses. And by doing that, essentially is allowing you to kind of just focus on the resonant modes of your innermost self and not be disturbed by like the prediction errors of the lower layers. And then, yeah, I mean, there's like a third way of like not being bothered by something, which is equanimity, but like that's, yeah, a whole other kind of can of worms. But yeah, like what you're describing is exactly right. It would be kind of like when you become like perfectly good at predicting a stimuli, like predicting a metronome, it actually kind of disappears. And like one of the metaphors that I use here is, I mean, like the only thing that you can actually experience is the interference pattern between your resonant modes. If you have like such a simple set of resonant modes inside you that they don't produce an interference pattern, it's almost kind of like what it's like to be a photon from the inside. Like, yes, from the outside, it looks like you're kind of like doing this like, circular motion, you're circularly polarized, like you're moving kind of this helical way. But from the inside, it actually feels like you're perfectly static, right? Like because the movement is actually only relative to the outside. So likewise, like from the outside, it may look like you're this, vibrating thing. But from the inside, it actually feels like you're just a static structure. Because the vibration is something that you can only sense in a relative way.
Gotcha. Okay.
You can only sense your own you can only sense your own vibratory modes by the effects they have, by the way in which they interface with one another, not intrinsically, because
Gotcha.
yeah, again, it's kind of like a photon cannot perceive its own kind of circular motion. Yep.
Interesting. Okay. This is reminding me, by the way, to just go back to Harry Parch briefly. So he has these like bowl things, like he made his own instruments out of glass and wood and all this, and he, I guess, basically used a process of annealing to tune his glass bowls.
Oh wow,
Somewhat unrelated, but I just wanted to get that in there before moving on.
that's awesome. I guess like a quick note about that. There's a video by Anders and Maggie, which are kind of volunteers from Sweden at QRI. Well, I guess like they're actually officially advisors now, where they actually demonstrate how like annealing can actually improve the harmonic properties of metallic bowls. I don't know if you saw that video, but
Actually, I just watched it before this, so
oh, that's
yeah,
awesome. Yeah, that's great.
yeah, it was interesting. And I'll put that link in the description and all that.
Yep.
So basically, I did this presentation on, I'm sort of playfully calling it the music of menstruation, and I was just trying to view like various time cycles in a musical lens, and like I had this picture of a waveform up the other day, and it almost from a certain angle looked indistinguishable from like stock market charts, and so I was thinking about how like music is largely just this like time-based thing. Like it's like time is the main substrate. Even if it's frequency, then it's like frequency is still a function of time. And I'm curious if this triggers anything in your mind that you think is interesting, like sort of like making it just about time more.
Well, I mean, I'm so here's the thing, like essentially there's like these dualities in consciousness, and one duality, I mean, and duality, so like in math, like oftentimes like dualities mean that there's like two ways of looking at something. There's like two perfectly equivalent descriptions of something.
Mm.
So just as an example, like a polyhedra, um, you can take its dual by essentially putting like one dot in each face and connecting those dots with lines to the dots of the other faces. So that will give you the dual structure of it. And oftentimes, like if you do the same procedure to the dual structure, you get the original structure back. So,
Okay.
yeah, I mean, like I guess like an example is like the octahedron and the cube are like duals of each other, because if you put like a dot in each of the faces of a cube and you connect them, you get something that actually has like 8 triangular faces. So you're actually kind of like, yeah, exchanging essentially like the faces and the vertices with one another. So likewise in consciousness, I think there's like a lot of dualities. And one of the key dualities that exists in the structure of your experience is between synchrony, like temporal synchrony, and spatial symmetry.
Okay.
So, I mean, if you kind of like look at, okay, like what happens on DMT, another, I often talk about DMT. One of the things that happens on DMT is that you experience like symmetrical 2D structures, especially in like low doses. It's a very reliable effect. You look at a wall and it symmetrifies, and you can actually notice that when it symmetrifies, it simultaneously has a form of vibrating such that any two parts of your visual field that are part of kind of like a slab of symmetry are also in a state of synchrony. So essentially there is this duality between kind of like things vibrating in synchrony and then being spatially symmetrical. So
Gotcha.
essentially, yes, like music is inherently temporal when it comes to like the way in which it reaches us, like in terms of its, okay, like physical structure, how it actually manifests like physically in the world. But if you look at how music affects as, you know, central nervous system, I think it actually generates spatial patterns. So if you look at kind of like the brain on music at a particular moment in time, it would have like really, really good like neuroimaging to like fully, you know, visualize the harmonic resonant modes of that brain in that precise moment in time. I would essentially predict that like the temporal information of that song will actually be encoded as a spatial structure in the brain in that particular moment in time. So there's really kind of like a duality here, and I think like you would be missing out on quite a bit of like what music is if you only think about it in terms of like temporal structure and not in terms of how it influences spatial patterns.
Interesting. Okay. This is very interesting. We have to chew on that.
Yeah, I mean it is similar to like the Chladni plate, right? It's a like a vibrating like metallic plate. The spatial pattern of kind of like what it looks like to put sand on it, like what that looks like, is dual with the frequency of vibration. So by looking at what spatial pattern you have, I mean, and most of the ones that you see in kind of demonstrations will be the most simple ones, which is like, okay, what the spatial pattern looks like with just one vibrational mode. But you can actually use like a weighted sum of like these frequencies, and you know the actual shape that you will get will be like a non-trivial interaction between those like resonant modes. So by looking at the shape that you form, you can infer what is the frequencies with which you're vibrating this plate. So that is like a very concrete case where the spatial structure is dual to the actual like temporal information.
Interesting. Okay. Huh. Um, well, again, gonna have to chew on that.
Yeah.
Um, let's see here. What else do I have on this list? Oh yeah. So I've shared with you that I have this death metal project, Eliminativist,
Yeah, yeah.
and I saw something that you wrote, and you mentioned like, and this explains Japan noise and death metal, and so your sense of why people appreciate the aesthetic of death metal is that it's more of an energy parameter manipulation. Is that right?
To some extent, yeah. I would say that's maybe like 30% of like why people listen to death metal. There's like other things too. I mean, like, um, yes, I mean, like a lot of like what music is about like modulating the energy parameter. And for that, you actually require like several things. Like you require, for example, some degree of unpredictability, because essentially like surprises are energizing. There's like
Right.
a as a general pattern, whenever there's like something surprising, whether it's like positively surprising or negatively surprising, it doesn't matter. Like it's equally energizing. So you can actually produce like a lot of surprises with like fairly unpleasant sounds. And I think like a lot of, yeah, I mean, well, Japan noise is like a more extreme version of that. Um, the other thing too is that I mean, essentially, when you have like a very rough and dissonant pattern, you can point it at something that is rough and dissonant in your own mind. So if you do have like, things that you're kind of like suffering from, um, I don't know, like a breakup or like feeling of failure, whatever it may be, you can actually use like a very dissonant sound, very harsh sound to, in a sense, like block or cancel or almost kind of a, mm, yeah, kind of like mess with those patterns. And the net result can be a very significant hedonic improvement that like you're substituting, yeah, like a very unpleasant kind of like inner structure for something that is like sensorially rough, but is not as, emotionally unpleasant. So I think there's like another component of it. But then of course there is, just kind of the satisfaction that actually comes from getting acquainted with all of these patterns and like over time actually becoming somewhat better at predicting them. So there's kind of also the hedonic habituation that like I mean it's kind of like with a very hot sauces, so like that there is some degree of satisfaction in the capacity to slowly improve on your capacity to improve them, sorry, to process it without like getting hurt. So
Gotcha.
I think like likewise with like Japan noise and things like that. There's also a sociological component, which is you're getting some degree of satisfaction by, in a sense, being able to signal that you
Right.
are like a very tough person. You can like resist. You're like thick-skinned. You can, yeah. I mean, like there's a lot like in art. There's a lot of things like this. Like is like a lot of the things that supposedly people like are actually just ways for them to show how much abuse they can endure. Yeah, I mean, like the mosh pit of a concert or something like that is like, to some extent, like it's, yeah, it's interfacing with kind of like an instinctual need to, yeah, signal actually how tough one is.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of like art and like very harsh music is like tapping into that. So, yeah, what else? And yeah, I mean, finally, I mean, I think like even without like any sophisticated like neural annealing, like just getting the energy parameter high enough in and of itself can like be fairly pleasant. So again, with kind of like a hot sauce metaphor, like very very spicy hot sauces are like very unpleasant in the mouth, but they can energize all of your bodily sense such that you feel kind of these very pleasant harmonic resonant modes throughout your body, and kind of
Mm.
you can actually introspect and like, okay, like now waves of energy are coming like in a, up and down and up and down, all of that just coming from like, yeah, the hot sauce feeling. So that can be really pleasant, and for some people that might be enough to actually overwrite the net negative hedonic tone that comes from the pain alone. And I suspect, yeah, with Japan noise, something like that probably happens.
Interesting. I'm curious also if you have any sort of steel man of eliminativist theories of mine.
Yeah, sure. That's definitely a whole topic. I mean, I think um, I will definitely say that I think in general, like people who are like drawn to eliminativism will generally be like fairly smart, like fairly um, up there when it comes to kind of their philosophical intelligence and like the rigor with which they think. It is just that I mean, so yeah, I mean, in a sense, like it is kind of like a signal of being philosophically rigorous, um, and kind of like trying to look things from a new perspective, trying to find like a non-trivial description. And I mean, broadly speaking, I think there's quite a bit of wisdom in the approach of saying, okay, like our current conception of what consciousness is, of how minds work, really comes from like folk psychology, really comes from an evolutionary model, an evolutionarily adaptive model of what we are, of who we are. So, what are the chances that that will actually be able to kind of like carve nature at its joints, like actually describe what is like truly going on? And that if we instead kind of like start from scratch and say, well, let's not use those terms at all because they're just kind of like how the brain is modeling itself. This is not what the brain is actually doing. And let's instead like kind of like ground our vocabulary on like hard science, on physics, on computational theory. Then in some sense, just kind of like describing the brain without kind of like a top-down prejudice of like what is it that you're going to find. Mm-hmm. So in a sense, you're kind of like removing the clutter of expectations of all of the kind of like low grade evolutionarily adaptive but unlikely to be scientific priors with which you're analyzing the brain. So there's a lot of wisdom in all of that. Sociologically speaking, you can interpret that as kind of like a philosophical move that is generally actually fairly effective because it's allowing you to not be kind of like hacked by theories of consciousness. And like that is the thing though, like it is fairly easy to fall into kind of like a very bizarre and like in some sense like very unscientific account of consciousness. And like, yes, if you were to kind of like cluster actually how people think about consciousness, you will see that like, yeah, actually they have like either like very weird and unscientific views, or they kind of like tend towards eliminativism, and like it's kind of like bimodal, and like the place in the middle is actually fairly unstable. Like yeah, I mean, like think of, for example, like what is the half-life of people thinking rationally about DMT, right? Like either they kind of like have experiences with DMT and they kind of like slowly drift towards, yes, believing these are like actual aliens from another dimension, or they have DMT and get scared and they kind of like say something like, yeah, well, it was just a crazy hallucination, I'm not going to think about it. So the percentage of people who can actually like remain open about like, okay, what is this, while also acknowledging just like how bizarre it is like, yeah, a fairly small percentage. And likewise, I think like, yeah, people who can kind of like have like a really good model of consciousness, not based on folk psychology, but also that doesn't converge on, yeah, something like eliminativism. Yeah, it's kind of difficult. Yeah, a lot of it is kind of, I think, like avoiding being hacked by other people's models. But it is kind of like something that is very easy for people to overextend and like not realize that like, no, actually you can make like meaningful progress on understanding consciousness without becoming irrational. It's just that there's like relatively few like proofs of concept for that. I will say though that, I mean, I think like for me, one of the strongest arguments for like why consciousness is not just kind of like a folk psychology term is that there is a kind of like very meaningful way of talking about what is the scope of consciousness, like what is the range of things that you will classify as like actually part of kind of this consciousness phenomenon. And it's very simple. Essentially, whatever can be bound to an experience, I would say that's like a facet of consciousness or a particular qualia or like a qualia variety. So yes, like for example, like audio qualia and visual qualia are like very different. Like they're almost kind of like from completely different dimensions. I mean, it's really crazy how different like the experience of processing audio versus processing a visual scene. Very different experiences, but they can both belong to the same experience. They can both be part of a unified experience, and for that reason, I would say they both belong to the category, or to the kind of the set of qualia, of possible qualia. They're both like facets of consciousness, and that actually, for me, like kind of like really does draw kind of like a very natural boundary around, like, yes, this is a conscious phenomena, this is a conscious phenomena, or this isn't a conscious phenomena, which is a problem that, yeah, basically eliminativists tend to highlight, that it is like most people don't have a principled way of saying, yes, this is a conscious phenomena, this isn't a conscious phenomena. And on the basis of that, they can, like, yeah, legitimately argue that consciousness as a category, yeah, which is yeah, checking if you're still there.
Yeah. Was I freezing?
Oh, okay. Cool. Yeah, that consciousness as a category, it doesn't carve nature at its joints, right? Like, because it seems arbitrary from that point of view. But with kind of like, yeah, this binding argument, I think, like, all of a sudden, yeah, there's actually something objective you can say about, like, yeah, whether this is a part of the phenomenon of consciousness or not. And also, I would say that for the most part, it is true that things are not what they seem. Like, to a large extent, I almost think that a lot of eliminativists are actually kind of like getting at, like, indirect realism about perception. And, like, some of them, like, do realize that, like, okay, like, all that you ever experience is kind of like a world simulation inside your brain. You never experience the world directly. And they realize that, like, that insight is, like, fairly rare. That, like, the typical human lives under the impression and under the assumption that they're perceiving the world directly. And kind of like noticing that, yeah, so few people kind of like realize these, relatively simple insight. What are the chances that, like, other of our intuitive models of consciousness have, like, anything to do with reality? So yeah, it kind of like makes sense to, okay, like, let's throw the baby with the bathwater and just say, like, yeah, we can't actually meaningfully talk about consciousness from the inside. We need a new paradigm. Yeah, I guess the last thing I'll mention about eliminativism, though, is that usually they do live under the illusion or impression that language about physics, language about computation, is kind of something that you can talk about without clarifying what consciousness is. So, I mean, it's kind of it is not the case that, like, you can talk about mathematics and really, like, truly understand what it is that you're talking about without eventually bottoming out into talking about consciousness.
Gotcha.
It's, I think, like, my model that, like, if you go deep enough into trying to make sense of physics and math, you will come to the conclusion that they are actually patterns of qualia, and that all of mathematics is actually kind of like a systematic study of qualia patterns, also physics. And so, like, in some sense, I think, like, talking about consciousness is truly inescapable. Like, in the end, there's no way of actually kind of trying to make sense of the universe without first making sense of consciousness. There's no kind of a theory-free physics. There's, like, no theory-free mathematics. Like, ultimately, you need to even explain that as well. Like, what is it that you're doing with mathematics if you want to understand the universe? And in that sense, yeah, you can't actually talk about mathematics without talking about consciousness. So,
interesting. Huh. Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. A lot there. In the project Eliminativism I'm doing, like, a lot of what I'm trying to do is, like, remove my ego from the composition of the project. So, like, a lot of it's just, like, basically, like, random numbers that are filtered some way, and, like, aside from, like, creating the algorithm that generates it, it's like I can kind of just keep on rolling the dice and it'll create new stuff. And so I'm curious if you have thoughts on, like, sort of like computational modes of creativity, or like, the future of creativity in art when AI comes around and you can just press a button, have a new piece of art generated, and then, like, does that make our perceived sense of the value of the art decrease, or Is that just a whole new paradigm altogether, or curious what you think on that?
Yeah. I mean, yeah, for sure. I do think that AI generated art is coming, like, is very, like, will be really extreme. I mean, essentially, yeah, like, it's very likely that you know, AI generated art participating in art competitions in a blinded fashion, I think is like very likely to actually like win a lot of competitions. And like, okay, just as like, okay, chess, there was a threshold where all of a sudden like no human was able to actually compete against like the best chess algorithms.
Hmm.
And I think like right now, like, yeah, Magnus Carlsen is just has like stands no chance against, Stockfish or Alpha Zero. They're on a completely different level. Um, and like, yeah, that doesn't surprise us anymore, but like for a while it was, yeah, hard to imagine. Likewise, I mean, when it comes to kind of like capacity to produce extremely beautiful patterns that humans will enjoy, yeah, I mean, I think like we're probably fairly close to the point where, yeah, I mean, like AIs will probably just be better than humans, not only in terms of quantity but also just quality. Now, um, I think like that's not that big of a issue. Like, I think there's quite a bit of well, there's two things that actually attacks. First of all, is kind of the ego of the artists, and like that's yeah, definitely something that
Hmm.
culturally we will need to kind of like deal with. Is like, okay, how do we culturally process the fact that, yeah, like AIs can like produce more beautiful stuff than humans? Um, but then the second thing it interfaces with quite heavily is our cultural construction of the history of art.
Hmm.
And
Interesting.
that, I think, is something that we will kind of have to process and kind of like accept and move to a different paradigm. I've had kind of like, yeah, these visions of actually like what kind of a no self conception of art might entail. And essentially, I think we will enter sooner or later into a post historical conception of art.
Hmm.
So, right now, for example, even right now, like, I think like a lot of artists may think about themselves like, okay, like I might not be producing the most beautiful paintings or I might not be producing the most beautiful music, but I am adding to the historical conversation for like this particular type of art, right? It's kind of like, okay, like I have kind of a secure place in history of art because I at least like explored this style. And there's kind of like this sense of like leaving a mark in the history of art. It's like, okay, yes, I pushed the boundary in this particular way or this other particular way. And there's almost kind of like this attempt of artists to be embedded in history. It's kind of like,
Hmm.
okay, like,
Hmm.
and I think, yeah, a lot of like kind of like really random, bizarre, like art that looks like really strange, kind of like attempt, like, okay, like I cannot compete in the beauty department, but like maybe I can compete in this like particular niche and like at least have my name in the history of art in this particular way. Um, well, that's a kind of like very ego driven way of like
Totally.
processing what is it that we're doing in art, right? Like I think like a much more, yeah, like egoless approach to art is, hey, aesthetic experiences have intrinsic value. Can we generate more of those?
Hmm.
And it actually doesn't matter who generated it. It doesn't matter like who gets to be the author of it. What actually matters is just the intrinsic value of the aesthetic experience. So from that point of view, actually, all of a sudden, what you have is kind of like a flip in perspective from how do I leave my name in history to, hey, how do we optimize the valence of people, which is kind of this, yeah, actually becomes kind of this technical problem. And from that perspective, I think we will have maybe a transition into kind of a author-less conception of art and more of like art as kind of a something that you can do to the nervous system that is
Hmm.
like therapeutic and intrinsically valuable.
For sure.
Um, yeah, I don't know. Like maybe it's kind of this very Buddhist transition to like, yeah, art doesn't like it's not made by anybody. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's really just kind of a intrinsically valuable experience that happens.
Yeah, when I've mentioned this project to other musicians, who are, all great musicians, their usual response is like, well, the brain is so, tuned into doing all this and computing all this stuff automatically, so why not use the tool that's right in front of us? And it's like, well, I see what you're saying, but like, yeah, we could keep on going with it, and like generate like systematically more novel things, systematically more beautiful things. So why not? Um, yes, but what else do I have on here? I'm curious about your Subpac project. If there have been any developments on that.
Yeah, for sure. So there's a video you can access from Imperial, where Sean, essentially one of the people who's worked with Qualia, last year, essentially that was like his main project. Um, Basically, we explored kind of many different ways of generating patterns in the Subpac,
Hmm.
and trying to kind of articulate what is the music theory equivalent for like body vibrations. It's a really fascinating like area of research. However, it turns out that the state space of patterns that are pleasant is actually a lot more restricted than the state space of like musical like patterns that are pleasant. So like auditory experiences, I think there's like a lot more like room for like novelty and exploration than in like body vibration. And there might be like some like evolutionary reasons why. I mean, like um, with music, you can kind of like use a lot of, I think, like cognitive. Um, yeah, like music can be really cognitive. Like there's a lot you can do to kind of like reinterpret sounds and make them kind of like sound good or like produce like interesting moods. There's kind of like a lot of subtlety there. With body vibration, not so much. I think, and that's partly because there's only so many like healthy biorhythms, and like there's
Mm.
like a lot of ways in which your peripheral nervous system can be in a bad state, but there's like only relatively few ways for it to be in a really good state. So there's also another like subtlety here, which is that essentially I think that um, people who are like really messed up, so essentially people who like their peripheral nervous system is like really poorly calibrated, is like in a chaotic state, doesn't have kind of a self-organizing principle that is making it go into states of high integration. So like, yeah, basically if you're like very messed up, very sick, you can very much benefit from even very simple patterns. Like even just putting the Subpac and having like a 40 hertz vibration can be like an improvement for a lot of people. But if you are like actually really fit, you've been meditating a lot, you exercise, you're young, the 40 hertz is actually going to be like detrimental. Like it's actually going to be a downgrade. So um, it kind of like depends on like what your current health is. But essentially, if you're like really healthy, I think that, and like happy, there's actually like very few vibrations that like are actually an improvement on current state. Um, and yeah, basically that was kind of like challenging. We ultimately did find like ways of like producing like really awesome experiences, but the state space is not like as interesting as I hoped. I guess like that might be an important update. But the effect sizes are huge though. Like
Hmm.
with the final songs that we generated, um, basically we had kind of like this track which was kind of like a neural annealing track, which was like mostly focused on kind of like generating like very high levels of energy in a very pleasant way. And like yeah, that's quite transformative. Like I think like that probably could help quite a few people like process like traumatic experiences. And basically yeah, the reports that we got is like, yeah, this is kind of equivalent to I don't know, taking like 100 to 150 micrograms of LSD.
Hmm.
Yeah, and it's even stronger like if you combine it with weed or something like that. um, but then we also produced a soundtrack which was like specifically for like loving kindness, and that one also was like really healing but in a very different way. And I think like a lot of people who tried it actually said like it's the first time they ever experienced like that emotion.
Hmm.
And people who have tried like MDMA say like that there's like some significant overlap between that track and the experience of MDMA. I don't think it's like as profound as MDMA, but let's say maybe like 20-30% of like what MDMA does, we were able to replicate. And yeah, I mean, like I recommend watching that presentation. Like if people are like really curious about it, like we explored, for example, like fractal sounds. We explored trying to figure out what is the resonant frequency of different parts of the body. Like that's one of the things that we tried to figure out. And yeah, I mean, it is true that essentially there are like frequency ranges that like resonate much more with your chest or with your stomach, for example. Another thing that we did was, yeah, basically like how do you determine whether a vibration will become kind of like part of the foreground or the background of your awareness? We figured out that semantic content like is primarily through the audio, whereas like the emotional tone eventually primarily comes from the body vibration. So anyway, there's like a bunch of things like that. I recommend watching the presentation essentially.
So when you have like these songs, like I assume that the like upper frequencies are coming through headphones, and then like below a certain threshold is in the body.
Yeah.
Gotcha. It makes me think of like those percussion guns that you can like use to like do trigger point release on, you know, your foot or whatever. It's like just jamming a little silicone thing into your foot and releasing tension.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, like roughly speaking, yeah. I mean, the full range of frequencies in audio, then between 10 and 200 hertz in body vibration, but primarily between like 20 and 80, I would say. And then primarily between like 5 and 40 hertz for like visual stimulation. So yeah, basically there's like different frequency ranges. And actually, yeah, the lowest frequency is for the stroboscopic stimulation.
Gotcha. Interesting. I need to pee real quick. Do you need to pee?
Yeah, sure.
Cool.
I'll take it.
Let me just pause this real quick.
Yep.
Okay. So I've been reading Dune recently, and I had some questions about animal consciousness that came up in thinking about it, and you know, obviously this is all speculative. So I was thinking about, you know, the idea of like the maker and it being this humongous worm thing, but like, what would the valence of like a shy halud be like? Because I assume just because it's such a grand scale, like how would like a tiny scale animal, you know, translate to a huge version of that? And like it's ancient, but like does that mean that it has like complex cognitive processes? What would you think about this type of thought experiment?
Yeah. I mean, I think like the equivalent would be like asking what is the consciousness of a whale, and
Hmm.
it's obviously an open question, but like I mean, yeah, we're talking about yeah, I mean, a brain that is like larger than a human. I mean, like it's yeah, an insane thing. My suspicion is that yeah, they're actually hyper conscious. Like, and it's not necessarily that like the experience feels very intense, but like there's a lot of experience, and like there's like actually kind of like an important distinction that like the intensity of experience has more to do with kind of the concentration of energy, like how dense it is.
Hmm.
But you can actually have like a very large experience that feels very loose, and like it's still a lot of qualia, but it just doesn't feel intense. So it could very well be that a whale has like a very large experience, but it feels like not particularly like intense from the inside, even though it is a lot of qualia. It's just that there's like a lot of space where to lay out that qualia. And I mean, I do suspect that, I mean, essentially, consciousness has like two main roles. One is like a raw causal effect, and the second one is like computational effect. So it's it may very well be the case that with a whales, for example, that the causal effect is actually much more important than the computational. I mean, of course, they have like complex societies. They have, they have to manage, like a very big body. There's like a lot that, the central nervous system has to compute. But it does feel like the brain is way larger than you would require in order to kind of like manage the social relationships. Like the size of the brain of a crow, would probably suffice. I don't know, for kind of the complexity of societies of whales. I mean, again, like we don't know, but then there's also just like the raw causal effect, and like I think like yeah, I mean, a world simulation generated by a brain needs to be of a certain size if it wants to influence a nervous system of a certain size. So it's almost kind of like, yeah, if you want to, how to say this, like if you want to sculpt like a very, very, very large sculpture with a clay, and do it fairly quickly, you might need like very large hands. Like even though the sculpture in the end might end up being like fairly simple, just the volume of it will require kind of like this very large equipment. Likewise, like to command a huge whale, you might require like a very large experience with kind of like a large surface area with which is going to be interfacing with like motor areas. So that would be kind of like, yeah, very strong like causal effect. Like it needs a lot of actual power, like a lot of like work work per second. And likewise, I would imagine one of these huge worms, like they may not require a lot of intricate computational power from consciousness, but they may require like a lot of energy in order to actually kind of command in a coherent fashion all of these huge nervous system. So in that sense, you could actually expect it to have like a very, very powerful experience, but very simple in nature. So an example I could use is like there are like, for example, states of consciousness like on LSD, where the experience itself may be like fairly simple. I mean, for example, like a very positive trip might be one where like you're meditating on loving kindness, and like it feels like you're radiating this energy from your chest. Like, I mean, in my interpretation, there's like still something that is happening in your world simulation. You're not actually radiating energy, but it feels like you're radiating a lot of energy. So like that would be like a very simple, very intense, and very powerful experience. And likewise, like if you were to kind of like mind meld with a whale or like with one of these huge worms, it may be that like from the inside, the experience is very simple, but it feels like that. There's kind of like this very simple thing that is going on, but it's like going on in a very, very bright and shiny way, influencing a very large space.
Interesting. I'm thinking about the essay, "What is it like to be a shy halud?"
Oh, nice. Yeah, yeah.
Cool. Well, I guess just a few quick things as we wrap up. I'm curious, what can basically like, quasi-scientifically minded musicians do for QRI?
Yeah, great question. Well, they could definitely submit data points for the tracer tool. That's well, everybody can do that, but I mean, yeah, like musicians are famous for being able to have kind of like very good eye-hand coordination while heavily intoxicated. So I think probably musicians are actually best equipped to kind of do one of these experiments. I don't know. I mean, I say it jokingly, but more broadly though, I think like producing really interesting valence effects with the Subpac, like if we can like expand the range of things that sound good or feel good, that would be great. I mean, definitely I would recommend like, yeah, watching the presentation by Sean. And I think like we will actually probably redo that presentation and put it on the main QRI channel just to make sure that, yeah, that content is out there, like high quality. Probably also writing songs about consciousness. I mean, I think like, yeah, like an album about eliminativism is pretty good. An album about the binding problem would be also awesome. Playing with a kind of a exploring how local binding happens in a musical space is kind of an interesting thing to try out. Like, in what way, or for example, like spatial music, like what are the rules for different sounds to couple with one another when you're like kind of exploring space and time. Figuring out that, like, on the one hand, yes, that's kind of like a very rigorous, psychophysics task. But on the other hand, being like playful and exploring will also help kind of like map out what are the rules for local binding in the auditory space. And I don't think that's like understood. So like, yeah, that's definitely something a musician could explore. Other things would be like, I would really love kind of a no nonsense list of songs that like legitimately sound really interesting in different states of consciousness. And I mean, the problem though is that there's kind of like an annealing bias here that like, if you ask around like, okay, what is the best song to listen on LSD, you will get like, okay, whatever people listened to on LSD that caused a strong like emotional transformation. And it's less what actually sensorially is like actually really interesting on that state, and it's more kind of like what was like personally transformative for that person in particular. So like, yeah, basically kind of like a no nonsense approach to these. It's like okay, like what is the actual sensorial effects of different states of consciousness, and what are like patterns that you have actually experienced and noticed. Any information of that kind, I think, would be really helpful for Qualia research more broadly. For example, like observations of the sort of this song produces the illusion of a high frequency pitch if you're on LSD, but like it doesn't if you're sober. Like that would be a fascinating like piece of data. Anything of that sort can actually be used for psychedelic cryptography, right? Like, and I would be very, very interested in that. Like, what are the rules for producing sounds that you can only listen to, or patterns you can only notice on an exotic state of consciousness? Anything of that sort, I would be very curious to have somebody explore, essentially.
I mean, the whole psychedelic cryptography thing is fascinating. So I'll have to read over that again and think about how that would translate to music.
Yep.
When I first had binaural beats explained to me, like, a decade or so ago, like somebody introduced them as a digital drug, basically, and I was like, okay. But I'm curious if, in that sort of spirit, if there's anything in the sort of like non-pharmacological realm, like more in like just like the sonic realm or visual realm, that could be used as like valence tech.
Yeah, I mean, I think like, yeah, the light, sound, and body vibration. I mean, that would be, and I mean, the effect size is pretty significant. I mean, as I mentioned, like people essentially do say that like it can help them process like difficult emotional experiences, process trauma, like allow them to get over something like a breakup, things like that. Yeah, I mean, like I'm considering kind of like doing more research on it, but like it's really not like the current priority at the moment. There's like several other projects that we're trying to wrap up, but yeah, I mean, I think like there's just like so much more to explore in the light, sound, and body vibration space, and a lot of like really crazy, really fun valence effects. I think there's like definitely still a lot of room to grow in VR for like hacking valence.
Mm-hmm.
Especially I think like if you have like eye tracking, because with eye tracking you can essentially account for kind of like saccadic movements, and there's like a lot of like really tricky fun things you can do with that. Yeah, it's a whole conversation, but yeah, I mean, essentially I think like VR, not in the conventional way of like, oh, let's show you like a very pretty thing, but actually in a much more like, oh, let's actually hack your visual system.
Like just have something to follow along for the saccades or whatever.
Yeah, yeah, you can do really bizarre things like create impossible colors, for example. Like, yeah, like if you show the boundary between like blue and yellow, for example, and with eye tracking, you reposition where the boundary is, so that like you're always looking at the precise boundary. Essentially, your retina kind of gets tired of it, and something that starts happening is that the blue and the yellow start to bleed into each other, and they combine and they generate a qualia that is actually impossible to experience otherwise. So, yeah, that's called impossible colors, and yeah, I mean that's a fascinating thing. I mean, obviously that it's not like a valence effect per se. Like it has valence implications because it's like
Mhm.
so novel. It will like surprise you, and you're gonna have a good time. But but I think like there's like much more interesting things. Like for example, interfacing with the harmonics of the visual system, like particular ways of like flickering, doing panning effects can kind of like generate like an MDMA like quality. So yeah, I think there's like a lot of room for growth in that space.
Awesome. And last thing I'll ask is basically a very similar question to what I just asked like a second ago, which is like how could musicians and artists help with EA causes
Oh, with EA
without
causes.
donating a bunch of money?
Ah, that's a great question. Hmm. Yeah, I mean, traditionally, musicians and artists help with causes by writing songs about them,
Mhm.
kind of embedding that ideology into their music. I don't know if EA is. I don't know what would it like. What would it look like for like a wood?
Existential risk.
Exactly. What would be kind of the Woodstock of EA? Like I don't know if it's viable, possible. Like I think the Asperger's quotient is just too high for it to actually kind of like congeal into some kind of a I don't know hedonic vibe. It's too intellectual for that. But I don't know. Do you have
Sub
any?
question.
Yeah,
Have you like seen any music that rationalists listen to? Because like the only music I'm aware of rationalists being into is from listening to the Harry Potter podcast version where he ends with Skaven, and I'm like, this is the only time I've ever heard of a rationalist talking about music.
Skaven.
Yeah, some composer. I have no idea.
Okay, okay. Mm, yeah.
I just get the sense that they don't listen to music. Oh,
Mm,
Strats maybe, but
I don't know if there's any clear clustering. I mean, I would probably say like much higher rate of classical music probably
okay.
than on the average, like than the general population.
But like conventional classical music or like modern wacky contemporary irritating stuff.
Probably both.
Okay,
Yeah.
interesting.
I would suspect there's like a much higher than average or like much higher than like standard like kind of general population. Yeah, I mean mostly because like a lot of these are kind of a I don't know gifted kids. Probably a lot of like them like did a lot of like like musical training. I'd imagine much higher than average, but that's not super interesting. So hmm, I'm
Yeah,
not sure.
I
Yeah,
asked Brian Tomasic some questions via email, and one of them was basically like, how does art fit into your life personally? And it was an interesting response because it was basically like, I watch TV when I exercise. um,
wow, yeah,
but like he doesn't really listen to that much. Like he enjoys music, he enjoys poetry, but he's like, I feel like I might as well do other practical things.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah. Yeah, I mean it's gonna be highly modulated by the Asperger's quotient, and it's fairly high in the community. So I don't think it's not there's no like strong emphasis on art. And actually, I would probably worry like if it starts to become like very art driven, it probably means it was like taken over by some like sociopaths with like artistic skills. Like I mean, it's like the same as like uh like this is a kind of like a funny observation. Like if you look into like the big event where they released, I believe, like Windows 95 or Windows XP. I think it was like 95. Um, Basically, you have like all of these like Microsoft engineers come on stage. You can find this on YouTube. Kind of like dancing, and like Bill Gates is like trying to dance, and like you can notice like
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
they have no idea how to dance, and like it's not only that they have not practiced, but like you can tell their nervous system is just not coupling properly to the music, and like I think that's basically the average um autism or Asperger's spectrum is just way too high for like dancing as a group. um
High AQ, low ENQ.
exactly. 100%. And the thing though is that if I go to kind of like a machine learning startup or something, and I see the engineers dance and they're dancing really well, I would like negatively update on how good the startup is. Like
Interesting. Okay.
I would actually suspect like, yeah, they're probably just marketing. Like I don't actually believe they have like real, actual, innovative technology. Because those things are just so anti-correlated. So I would worry. Like if there's a lot of like artistic competence in EA, it probably means like EA went to trash. Like it's just not. There's no systematizers there anymore.
Gotcha. Interesting. That's funny. Cool. Well, I'll let you get out of here. Andres, thanks so much for talking to me. Thanks for coming on for the first round two for Prime number 43. It was enjoyable to talk to you, and yeah, you're always welcome back.
Thank you. Likewise, was awesome participating. And yeah, talk to you another time.
Sounds good. All right. Adios.